Ladies and gentlemen, this is terrific. This end of the thing is beginning to flake off. The top is beginning to rotate like a screw, and this thing must be hollow. Move it!
On Halloween Eve, October 30, 1938, America became the unwitting victim to one of the most famous yet somewhat unintended radio hoaxes in history. In what started out as a simple Mercury Theatre recital of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, broadcast by Orson Welles, quickly became the stuff of legend as thousands of listeners across the country thought the invasion they heard over the airwaves was occurring for real.
I say, do you still think it's a meteor, Professor?
I don't know what to think. The metal casing is definitely extraterrestrial, not found on this Earth.
Even today, nearly 90 years later, the symbolism of this historical event is a clear reminder of the overwhelming power and influence of radio. The device that was to eventually become radio was first envisaged as far back as 1865, even though an actual demonstration of radio waves travelling through the air didn't occur until the mid-1880s. Yet despite its technological advances, it still took an additional 40 years before radio reached a level of maturity, whereby consumers found the need to gravitate to this new entertainment medium. But when they did, they flocked to it in very much the same way as other technological innovations which had once been in the realm of science fiction, such as automobiles and aeroplanes. By 1926, both radio and its transmission network were significantly established in America to allow the formation of the first major broadcasting station, NBC. NBC was created by the Radio Corporation of America, whose content included news, music, live reporting of sporting events, comedy shows, and eventually radio plays. While sitting alongside NBC were a myriad of local broadcasters who were primarily catering for their own cities and districts. Yet something else of interest also occurred in 1926. This year also saw the release of the very first magazine devoted entirely to science fiction. Yes, this was Amazing Stories, created by Hugo Gernsback, who was somewhat of an entrepreneur in the field of electronics, which ironically included radios. With science fiction being well established both in print and on the screen, its presence on the airwaves was a somewhat random affair, often appearing in radio theatre shows whose focus was on suspense and horror. Included in this mix were stories such as Meteor Man and Rocket Ship for Lights Out, The Man Who Was Tomorrow for the Radio Guild Theatre, RUR for Columbia Workshop, and The Time Machine, as well as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea for Favourite Story. Eventually, though, science fiction was able to break through onto the airwaves in its own right, in what was the very first science fiction radio show ever created.
Buck Rogers in the 25th century.
From a historical perspective, Buck Rogers first appeared in a 1928 issue of Amazing Stories under his original name of Anthony Rogers, before appearing in the two novellas Armageddon 2419 AD and The Airlords of Han, all of which were written by Philip Francis Nowlan. Shortly thereafter, Anthony was renamed to Buck before commencing a very successful run as a comic strip in 1929. The radio series itself was produced by CBS and ran from November 1932 through to May 1936, with around 720 15-minute episodes being produced. Somewhat poetically, just as Buck himself was able to live in the future, so did his radio persona, with Buck Rogers in the 25th century making return appearances in 1939, 1940, and again from 1946 to 1947, all the while being voiced by numerous actors, including Matt Crowley, Curtis Arnold, Carl Frank, and John Larkin. After embracing a new sense of creative freedom on the radio, Buck's futuristic adventures also saw the introduction of the special art form which would later be known as sound effects, particularly for ray guns, rockets, and even robots. Yet most significant of all, Buck Rogers proved that there was definitely a market for regular science fiction on the airwaves. So not only were they an ideal form of entertainment, but they were also cost-effective to produce compared to their on-screen brethren. With Buck Rogers being the only radio series on the air, it was only natural to expect that competition wasn't far away. 3 years later, in April 1935, Flash Gordon, who had not only been created the year prior, but would also appear in the first of his iconic movie serials a year later, made his debut on radio, which closely copied the Buck Rogers production format. Under the somewhat cumbersome title of The Amazing Interplanetary Adventures of Flash Gordon, this MBS-produced series only ran until October of 1935 for a total of 26 episodes, with Flash being voiced by Gail Gordon. Yet barely a couple of days after concluding, the series returned under the new yet equally cumbersome title, The Further Interplanetary Adventures of Flash Gordon. However, unlike its predecessor, which was a faithful adaptation of the comic strip, this new version had Flash, Dale, and Zarkov having adventures in locations such as Atlantis.
Grove's emulsified nose drops bring to your radios the further interplanetary adventures of Flash Gordon. Travel with Flash Gordon, Dale Arden, and Dr. Zarkov to the lost continent of Atlantis on the ocean's floor.
Rather surprisingly, details on this series are somewhat scarce, and it's unknown who the vocal cast were. In any event, the series only had a lifespan of 5 months before wrapping up in February 1936 with 74 episodes produced. By the end of the 1930s, science fiction was continuing to thrive in the newsstands and bookshops, whilst in the cinemas, films had effectively made way for the ever-popular weekly serials. From a radio perspective, the small amount of science fiction material being produced was still mostly aimed at the younger market, which even included a special adaptation of King Kong in both 1933 and 1938, with the latter series still being available today. Yet many things changed with the arrival of the new decade, including one of the biggest success stories in the history of radio.
The Adventures of Superman.
Faster than a speeding bullet. More powerful than a locomotive. Able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. Look, up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's Superman.
This new series was launched in February 1940 and not only introduced Superman's vulnerability to kryptonite, but was also the first to depict him flying. Yet of far greater significance was the 1945 episode Mystery of the Wax Men, which was the first to feature both Superman and Batman. Although the two superheroes had appeared in numerous promotional images and individual comic panels prior to this date, this was the first instance where they worked together as part of the story's narrative, which aired 7 years before they joined forces in a comic. Yet what was most incredible of all was that this series stayed on air for a massive 11 years, with over 2,088 15 to 30-minute episodes being produced. In addition, the voice of Superman for 9 of those years was provided by Bud Collyer, who employed a deeper tone of voice when portraying the Man of Steel, as opposed to the higher-pitched Clark Kent.
Where are you?
At police headquarters.
Well, rush down to the parking lot in back of it. I'll pick you up in less than a minute. Now, up with this window. Out! And away!
For its final 2 years, when the series moved to ABC, the stories were effectively reused scripts from earlier episodes, with Michael Fitzmaurice taking on the signature role. Up until the release of The Adventures of Superman, science fiction radio shows had been aimed squarely at the children's market. So the question had to be asked, was there anything for adults? Indeed there was. 1941 saw the release of NBC's science fiction show
Platitude Zero,
created by radio producer and screenwriter Ted Sherdman.
Platitude Zero.
Unfortunately, very little is known about this show or its stories, although it was once described as more of an adventure series than one aimed at adults. Furthermore, it's not beyond reason to theorise that the onset of World War II for America is what brought its run to a premature end. Yet somewhat poetically, it eventually found a new lease of life many years later when the first story was produced as a Japanese movie featuring an American cast in 1969. Sadly, with the World War II years impacting many creative outlets, other than the adventures of Superman and the 1947 reappearance of Buck Rogers, as well as a new 1947 adventure anthology series called Escape, which featured the odd science fiction story, science fiction as a whole didn't return to the airwaves until 1950. But when it did so with a massive outpouring of all new content for both the juvenile and adult markets. For younger listeners, 1950 saw the debut of the new independently produced series
The Planet Man. This is the fascinating story of Dantro, the Planet Man, troubleshooter for the League of Planets organization, the law enforcement body for peace and justice in the celestial world, whose headquarters and center of operations are situated on the capital of all the planets, Planaria Rex. From Mercury to Pluto, wherever danger threatens the universe, you will find Dantro, the Planet Man, fighting for fair play.
Despite the cast and other production details being mostly unknown, many of its 88 episodes still exist and are available for listening today. Conversely, on the adult front, 1950 saw the premiere of Beyond Tomorrow, which was not only written by Robert A. Heinlein, but was also CBS's first science fiction radio show.
Beyond Tomorrow, a new program of probabilities drawn from the vast library of science fiction, where anything is possible and possibly may happen to you.
Unfortunately, only 3 episodes were ever produced, and there is still a level of uncertainty by historians as to whether they were ever broadcast on air, though some dates have this occurring in April 1950. Regardless, it is generally accepted that the anthology series 2000 Plus, produced by MBS, was the very first adult-based American science fiction radio show.
2000 Plus!
Especially as it not only used purposely written stories, as opposed to adaptations of existing literature, but the date listed for its first broadcast was March 1950, a month before Beyond Tomorrow. In the end, 2000 Plus lasted for 2 years. However, recordings of the episodes are difficult to find. 1 month after the launch of 2000 Plus was the release of the all-new
Dimension X.
This latest series had the distinction of featuring stories written by both up-and-coming as well as established science fiction authors, including Isaac Asimov, Robert Bloch, Ray Bradbury, and many others. Having these science fiction luminaries contribute to the series not only gave it an immense amount of credibility, but all 50 episodes still exist and are available today. As the 1950s progressed, the creation of radio shows with their roots in TV continued to appear. In this instance, the anthology series
Tales of Tomorrow,
which had been on TV since 1951, was adapted for radio in 1953 by ABC, then shortly thereafter by CBS for what was a very short 4-month run. Rather surprisingly, instead of simply adapting its own on-screen stories, all their source material came from Galaxy Science Fiction magazine. Sadly, only 15 episodes were produced, with both the radio and TV series finishing their runs in the same year. Yet whilst these programmes catered for the adult market, there was still room for new products to entertain younger listeners. Sometime in around August or September 1950 was the premiere of the live broadcast radio series Space Patrol by ABC.
Space Patrol! High adventure in the wild, vast reaches of space. Missions of daring in the name of interplanetary justice. Travel into the future with Buzz Corey, Commander-in-Chief of the Space Patrol!
Which not only ran concurrently alongside its television counterpart, but its stories offered the writers a large range of scope to work with, especially as they didn't have to worry about designing and creating different planets and exotic locations as they did for the TV show. In addition, the cast for both series remained the same, which ensured a strong sense of audience familiarity and in-universe continuity. Rather surprisingly, the series continued to broadcast its stories live for 2 years before converting to the pre-recorded format in around October 1952. Sadly though, only a small number of episodes are known to have survived out of the 129 which were produced. As if to follow Space Patrol's lead, the children's TV series Tom Corbett, Space Cadet, also from ABC, decided to create a radio adaptation of its own, which was released in January 1952.
Tom Corbett, Space Cadet.
Again, much like Space Patrol, the series utilised the talents of its TV cast. But sadly, its time on the airwaves was short-lived, with the 52-episode series wrapping up in around June that same year. With Space Patrol continuing to lure in younger listeners, it was only natural other shows would use it as an inspiration when creating their own products. A good example of this was Captain Star of Space.
From out of the future comes Star of Space!
Which ran from 1953 to 1954, starring John Larch. In this series, Captain Rocky Star of the Space Rangers travelled the galaxy fighting crime in his ship, the Shooting Star. Created and written by cast member Tom Hubbard, it's believed only 8 episodes still exist out of the 104 produced, with just 5 of those known to be in circulation. In 1953, NBC produced the series Stroke of Fate, which was written by Mort Lewis and George Faulkner. Despite not being considered science fiction at the time, by today's classification, it would come under the sci-fi heading of alternate reality. The uniqueness of its 30-minute episodes surrounded an aspect of real history with a point of divergence from established fact, such as Abraham Lincoln choosing not to become president, or General Lee leading the Union Army instead of the Confederates in the American Civil War. Fortunately, all 13 episodes of this unique series have survived and are still available today. By 1955, science fiction in America was going through a period of massive growth and unparalleled success, thanks mainly to the great films which had been released in the cinemas, as well as the numerous TV shows being beamed into people's homes. Yet despite the genre revelling in its prosperity, unfortunately, radio was about to experience the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, all in the space of 1 year. To begin with, the massively successful Space Patrol franchise finished its production run on both TV and radio after 5 wonderful years. Yet on the flip side, this year saw the release of a brand new adult-based science fiction anthology series, which is still considered to be one of the best radio dramas ever produced. Yes, this was X-1.
Countdown for blastoff. X -5, -4, -3, -2, X -1, fire.
From the far horizons of the unknown come transcribed tales of new dimensions in time and space. These are stories of the future, adventures in which you'll live in a million, could be years, on 1,000 maybe worlds. The National Broadcasting Company, in cooperation with Galaxy Science Fiction Magazine, presents
X -1.
Commencing broadcast in April 1955, X-1 by NBC was initially seen as a return of Dimension X, as the first 15 episodes were updated stories from that series. Yet beyond this, the episodes were populated with all new material written by the leading science fiction writers of the day. Importantly though, X-1 was considered a benchmark in quality radio production in terms of casting, editing, sound effects and music. For this reason, all of its 126 episodes continue to hold up even after 70 years. 2 years after the premiere of X-1, 1957 saw the release of what was to be the last of the 1950s science fiction radio dramas,
Exploring Tomorrow.
This 29-episode anthology series was created by the editor of Astounding magazine, John W. Campbell, who promoted it by saying it was by science fiction ears for science fiction ears. In other words, its focus was on real science, which attracted many of the leading science fiction writers of the day. Despite shows like X-1 and Exploring Tomorrow continuing to create high-quality and entertaining science fiction material on the airwaves, unfortunately, they were up against a rival format which they had no chance of competing against: television. And to a lesser degree, the real-life space race, which had commenced after the launch of Sputnik that same year. As a consequence of this, 1958 saw both X-1 and Exploring Tomorrow conclude their production runs. And with their demise came the end of what would later be known as old-time science fiction radio. Somewhat ironically, across the Atlantic in the UK, a similar fate awaited the long-running multi-part radio series Journey into Space. This series, which had commenced broadcast in 1953, and at one point was so successful it pulled in a larger audience than television, also ceased broadcasting in 1958. Fortunately, in the decades since, science fiction radio shows have made the occasional return from time to time. Yet despite the airwaves having fallen silent when it came to great science fiction content, there was still something positive to take from this unique period of history. Fortunately, many of these great shows are still accessible online for free, as many, if not all, are within the public domain. So in this modern age where people are keen to listen to their favourite shows and stories via podcasts and audiobooks, there's still a special place for a good old-fashioned science fiction radio play to bring joy to the world.